Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Jacob Rees Mogg, who I really want to hear from on a particular issue, Jacob. We're at this conference, NatCon. It's gone quite well, I'd say, despite a few loony lefties disrupting your speech. And the one thing I think I've heard more than anything else, Jacob, is the disparity in conservatism in Britain in general, where actually conservative values of the kind being championed here aren't being advocated by, dare I say, lily-livered liberal Mr. Sunak.
Well, I'm not going to be rude about Mr. Sunak, who actually I think has many conservative values, even though there are areas that I disagree with him on. I think it's important to discuss policies. When you're on the backbenches, you're free to do so. The constraint of ministerial responsibility is something I rather chafed at, so I now have the opportunity to say what I think. And it is an error not to be proceeding with the retained EU law bill.
Yeah.
But Rishi Sunak, I think he does believe in many of the values we're talking about today. He believes in the family, for example. He's been a supporter of that. I think he is potentially more socially conservative than some of his predecessors were. So I wouldn't give up hope on the Prime Minister.
Another contention, 13 years of Conservative government, yet not 13 years of Conservative policy making. Now, many are also arguing that the Windsor Framework actually is a dead weight on the Brexit project itself. We can't diverge away from EU laws like in the way in which we might like to. Now, the Prime Minister sold the Windsor Framework as the greatest thing since sliced bread. You know, Northern Ireland, Ulster would be free. But it's not quite the case, is it?
No, I'm afraid I think that's right. And if you look at the 590 EU laws that they've decided to get rid of, they are essentially trivial things that have already expired or are relations between countries not involving the UK. I don't think there is a single rule that we are getting rid of that would mean there was any divergence between us and the EU in what we currently do. And I'm sure you're right, that is in part influenced by the Windsor Framework. Because
we would be diverging from a constituent part of the United Kingdom, were we to do that?
Or not. That's not particularly clear as to whether Northern Ireland would be diverging too. It can in some areas, it can't in others.
Yes.
The Windsor Framework is not a satisfactory agreement, and I expect in time that will become clearer.
Yes. I mean, what would your message then be after being at this conference? I mean, for me, it's been a fantastic outlet because I think a lot of people have needed a platform to vent, you know, and actually put forward what they would like to see as the direction of not just the country, but of the party. You know, the oldest party democracy is known, you know, a fantastically successful beast. But it's always adapted with the times. How would you like to see it adapt today?
Which is why I think conferences like this are very important, because you're right, we need to have the policies of today rather than reheating the policies of the past. And so we need to be thinking about how do we make things better from where we are now. So I thought Miriam Cates' speech was very important.
Brilliant.
About how do you encourage the family? How do you ensure that we have children being born? Because otherwise our population will decline, we'll be dependent on mass migration, which is unpopular. Is there a role for government, or is that actually something you need to leave to families for themselves? But can we stop discriminating against the family as we currently do in our tax and benefits system? I'm a great advocate of free trade outside the European Union. We have an opportunity for freer trade. Why is that? Because it makes the life of consumers better. What should be our guiding light? Allowing this generation to have a better standard of living than the previous generation, and the next generation better than this generation. How do you do that? You allow people's money to go further, and you do that by increasing the supply of goods at a lower price. And that's all conservatism, and we need to be pushing for it.
Do you think voters in Somerset, for example, though, will look at if the ONS figures are, which are predicted, are right, 1 million people coming here in a single year, do you think voters in Somerset and elsewhere would say, well, I was told tens of thousands, I voted for Brexit in order to ensure we could control our own borders. Is this not a dereliction of duty by the government not to ensure it's so?
I mean, I think voters will be very cross indeed about the failure to control legal migration. The Conservatives have been saying we would do that since 2010. It is under our control. And we've got to face up to difficult choices. why are we getting this large number of people coming in? Well, mainly it's to fill low-skilled jobs, or it's for universities, or it's the dependence of people at universities. We start by saying, if you're coming to university, you cannot have any dependence, full stop. If our economy is dependent on the higher education sector, and that's entirely dependent on migration, then we're going to have to look at doing other things. And the same applies to very low-skilled jobs. If we can't pick fruit, unless we import people on very low wages to pick fruit, why don't we grow things that can be picked by machine and import our fruit from the countries where they've got the cheap labour? And the labour can then stay in the country and pick the fruit there rather than coming over here to do it. And if we can't get people to work in social care, perhaps we need to pay them more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hard job as well. You know, what they're doing is they're heroes.
That's right. So people want to go and work in supermarkets rather than in social care because they're paid more.
Yeah.
So we import cheap labour. Actually, the problem is we're paying people in social care too little, and we want a high-skilled, high-wage economy, not a low-skilled, low-wage, high-immigration economy. And what we're currently doing is making the latter rather than the former choice.
And just finally, we've heard from Yoram Hazony, who set up this wonderful conference.
Very impressive man.
Yoram was saying, making an argument, a case for actual, I guess what you would define, Jacob, and I don't wish to put words into your mouth, you're perfectly capable of forming them yourself. Protectionism, essentially, a form of protectionism where the nation state, a lot like President Trump did, has certain forms of, it may be in the form of tariffs or other forms of protections, and in order to bolster the nation state and be able to rely more domestically on things like your manufacturing, etc., etc. Now, you are, and I've been following your career for a long time now, a staunch advocate of market liberalisation, free markets, and etc. Is there a tension within the conservative movement between those who, well, it's almost like the Corn Laws again, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. There's been this tension in conservatism back to the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1841, or Peel's administration from 1841. I think it actually happened in 1845. Protectionism is support of the producer, of the monopolist interest against the consumer. You saw that in the 1840s when the protectionists wanted to support the rich landowner against the poor worker who needed cheap bread. And you, to my mind, should always be on the side of cheap bread rather than the high cost of corn. And that if other countries can produce it more efficiently, well, then you must have a comparative advantage somewhere else. You must devote your skills there, you will make more money there. But also, if goods can be bought more cheaply, people have more disposable income to buy other things, which will allow the economy to grow in other areas.
For example, Sunderland, the Nissan plant there, a lot of people argue that actually having those kinds of industries in a region like that, post-industrial of course, is actually important and worthwhile to have what they would
But we don't need tariffs to do that. Sunderland is one of the most efficient car manufacturing plants in the world. What we need to do is have cheap energy prices.
I agree.
And we have a terrible energy policy. But because we've got a bad energy policy doesn't mean we should then put tariffs on to protect high-cost manufacturing, which we have made high cost.
Yeah.
So we are ruining our steel industry because we have the most expensive electricity in Europe. We're 25% higher for industrial energy users. That's all green extravaganzas. We need to get rid of that, have cost-competitive energy, then our steel will be globally competitive, rather than making the whole world more expensive.
But that is, of course, incompatible with the government's policy of net zero by 2050, is it not?
Well, we cannot will the end without considering the economic cost of the means.
Yes.
Nobody will vote to be cold and poor.
Yeah, I agree.
If what we're saying is vote to be cold and poor, we will lose. If 2050 requires us to be net zero and cold and poor, we will lose, and therefore we have to review whether that is practical.
Couldn't agree more. Jacob Rees Mogg, we could do with a few more like you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.